oh, well, my grandma bought a house for $100,000 in the 1970s and she sold it for $1 million in 2020. It's the best investment your grandmother ever made because she didn't make any other investments. Right? There wasn't this ability to just go out and buy index funds decades ago. I mean, the 401k was invented in the 80s.
Welcome to the Military Money Manual Podcast, where every episode is all about achieving financial independence in the military faster than before. We believe personal finance shouldn't be boring or intimidating. Building wealth can be simple, and financial freedom is the ultimate financial goal. Now, here's your hosts, Spencer and Jamie.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Military Money Manual Podcast. Spencer Reese here from militarymoneymanual.com, joined by my co-host, Jamie. Hey, Jamie. Been a long time.
Hey, Spencer. Good evening.
Yeah, good evening. Today on the show, I wanted to dispel a myth, and that myth is that you need to buy a house to build wealth or become wealthy in America. That a house is a tax shelter, that all wealthy people become wealthy through real estate. I'm sick of seeing this, Jamie. Online, you see all the real estate gurus on the social media platforms, on the old media, all over the web, on the blogs. I'm going to take the contrarian view here. I'm going to say, don't buy a house on active duty. Home ownership for a population that moves every 2 to 5 years just doesn't make sense. It adds unnecessary stress and financial strain to your life, and you just don't need it. So this episode is not for you aspiring real estate moguls. Let's start with that. Let's get that out of the way. If you listen to the Bigger Pockets podcast, if you're excited about the idea of being a landlord, if you know your cap rate, then go for it. Have fun building a real estate empire, like the game of Monopoly. It takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of risks. And if you're successful in doing it, more power to you. But if you're on the fence about this, or if you're stationed in a place where you don't intend to retire or your family isn't anywhere near, then why would you buy a house there? And there's always exceptions to the rule. Like I just said, if maybe you're stationed where you want to retire, where you're from or where your family is. But in general, don't buy a house on active duty. And so this episode is for everyone else. It's not for the aspiring real estate moguls. If you're on the fence about buying on active duty, it's okay to rent. We want you to feel confident and comfortable with a real estate purchase. And if it feels like a stretch, or you're not excited about it, or you're running the numbers and you just can't make the math, then don't do it.
Yeah, Spencer, you know, military lifestyle is really unique, and all of our listeners know that, but there are only a few things that you can control in life. And when you give up some of that control to the military, it makes real estate a little bit tricky sometimes. And for the average military person, especially if we're talking about someone that's new to the military, or maybe they just got married or some situation like that where they kind of feel the societal pressure to buy a house and be an adult. And to be honest, sometimes that's what it comes down to, is like, this is what culture says that I should do as I get older. And it might be right for some people, but there's plenty of very, very wealthy people that don't own, and they don't own intentionally. And they may have different reasons for that, such as they don't want to deal with the work. They want to be able to move whenever they want, or they want to do 6 months in New York City and then 6 months in LA and 6 months in Spain or whatever. So it's not like a poor people thing to not own a house. And there are a lot of people that do get wealthy from real estate. But for the average military family, like, it's definitely not a step one in your journey towards building wealth for sure. So just try to remove that societal pressure that this is what adults do, is they grow up, they get married, they buy a house, or whatever you kind of have in your brain to make you feel like you need to do this, which gets a lot of military families into a really precarious financial situation when they feel pressure to do something that's expensive. It is one of the biggest purchases, probably the biggest purchase you will make in your entire lifetime.
There's a lot of wisdom in that, Jamie. I mean, I know when I was growing up, I thought that there was a path, right? I thought there was a plan. It was, you graduate high school, you go to college, you get your degree, you join the military, you serve your time in the military, you get married.
You usually get married. Okay.
Well, yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry. You graduate college, you get married, you buy the house with the white picket fence. But here's the problem is, when you're in the military, you're going to be moving a lot. And even if you think, oh no, my career field doesn't move, or there's only a couple places that I can get stationed, the military loves to throw surprises at you. Buying a house is not a natural step that everyone has to take at some point in their adult life. And too many people assume that, and they get in over their head, and it changes your lifestyle. Now you have to make that monthly payment every month. It's a monthly payment, or you're going to lose your house and your credit's going to tank, and it's going to be not very fun for you and probably cause you a lot more stress and anxiety. It also affects your risk tolerance too. When you have a house and when you have to make monthly mortgage payments, that changes your calculation. All of a sudden, that money's allocated and it's going towards that mortgage payment no matter what. And that can change how you live your life and the jobs you take and the risks that you take in other parts of your life.
And I want to talk about more risks in a second, Spencer, but I don't want to drag this preamble out too much. However, I'm going to a little bit longer because sometimes people think that it's the best way or the easiest way to become a millionaire or to build wealth. And it is possible. A lot of people do get extremely wealthy through real estate. But you hear these stories of, my grandparents bought their house for $20,000 and now it's worth $900,000. Like that does happen, but it's probably not going to happen to you during your military career. Even if it's a 40-year career, you're probably not going to see those kind of numbers that our parents' generation and the generation before them experienced for home growth. But Spencer, let's talk a little bit about some of the risks. So what are the risks involved in buying real estate that you want people to think about or be kind of weary of or be warned about?
Yeah, this was just a list of, just brainstorming for maybe 5 minutes about some of the risks. But I think a lot of people, they go into this decision of buying a house and they think it's the next natural progression. But if you don't sit down and you actually do the math and not just like, okay, what is my mortgage payment going to be? And what is, the principal plus interest? And what is my, taxes going to be? What's my homeowners association going to be? What's my, my monthly payment going to be after all this? Utilities, you got to throw utilities in there as well. But you got to add all those things up and take a good hard look at it and understand that it's okay sometimes to have a housing situation that's above your BAH. And it's okay a lot of times to have a housing situation that's below your BAH. That's something that I did at a couple duty stations where we were actually below my BAH and I was able to bank the difference. All that to say, don't make your housing choices just based off of the BAH number, and also sit down and actually do the math. Figure out what your payment's going to be, and then what's the equivalent rent situation. And what you'll find, especially in 2024 right now, and this won't necessarily be true at other periods of time, but right now with interest rates so high, you're very, very hard pressed to find a situation where buying month to month is cheaper than renting. And oh, by the way, a lot of times you're going to have to put a down payment down as well. And we'll talk about a little bit of that later about what else could you do with that down payment money. Hint, hint, probably putting it into index funds. But if you don't sit down and you do that math, then you're never going to be able to figure out, okay, is this actually a good investment? And is it worth the time and energy to do it? So many people will show me the numbers and they'll be like, okay, look, if I do this, this, and this, and I put 20% down, okay, BAH just barely covers it. What about, maintenance? 1% a year of your house value for maintenance a year. Did you set that aside? Do you have 6 months of an emergency fund to cover repairs? There's all these things that people, and oh, by the way, are you prepared to become a long distance landlord when you get PCS orders in 2 years? There's all these things that people just don't account for. And they try to make the numbers look better for housing or for buying a house. And on the rent side, it's pretty simple. You have your rent payment and maybe utilities, and that's about it. So I really encourage you, before we jump into the risks here, just think about actually crunching the numbers. And as a quick shorthand, what you could do is just take the mortgage, the principal plus interest, and then add 50% to that number. And that's, that might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but it might actually be pretty close to what your real monthly outgoings are to own a house. Now compare that number to what you could rent for. You're going to be really hard pressed to make purchasing worth it. Okay, let's talk about real estate risks. So what are the risks in buying real estate that you might not think of? Major, unforeseen, and necessary repairs. A lot of people report those. Unforeseen costs that emerge. The market tanks. We had Brian O'Neill on the podcast, and he talked about buying a house, I think it was in Vegas in like 2006, 2007. And I think, was it a 6-figure loss when they ended up doing a short sale on it? A tragedy befalls the family. That could happen whether you're, renting or buying. But if you own property and all of a sudden you got to, move home to look after someone, then that could become kind of that albatross around your neck. It's this property that you have to get rid of. Budget needs could drastically change. Someone loses a job, you PCS and your BAH gets cut in half. That happens a lot. losing income, maybe not such a big risk if you're in the military, but it's still possible. Risk that you get reassigned or PCS, yep, that could definitely happen. And then risks that you don't know that you don't know. I think that's the thing right there, that a lot of times people, they just don't leave themselves that flexibility of when you rent. I mean, you can, especially with SCRA, if you get deployment orders, you just let your landlord know, 30 days notice, you hand him the keys, you move your stuff out and you walk away. And that kind of flexibility is so valuable. And it's hard to put a dollar amount on it, but you probably could. You probably could put a dollar amount on it. And I bet it would be worth more than what you could make potentially buying a house.
Ms. Spencer, we have a couple of quotes that we've talked about before with regard to rent versus buy. And, remember the one where it's like your monthly income, your monthly rent is the highest amount that you'll ever pay in 1 month for your housing situation. And your monthly mortgage payment is the lowest amount that you'll ever pay. So when you're comparing those, you really got to make sure you understand what all the other costs are that come with it. Also, when you're talking about, I might lose my income, a lot of times, whether it's a two-income family or a mill-to-mill couple, a lot of times the family will base their housing budget off of two incomes. Then what happens if you do lose half your income, which that could happen with rent as well. But just, something to think about there is you really got to be careful how you do that math to make sure it's painting the correct story. And then the other thing I want to mention from that list you just gave is, we don't know what we don't know yet. And as a military family, when we're moving to a new town, you don't know the best neighborhood or the best school district or the best, neighborhood with walking score on Zillow. You can see some of that stuff, but it's different when you're there and you're in person and you're like, oh, this neighborhood park doesn't look as nice as the one across town that I really wish we would have lived in that neighborhood. And when you're renting, you have the flexibility to move if you want to. Whereas when you own a house, you're stuck with that until you sell it. And a couple weeks ago on Reddit, Spencer, remember that one? It was, can I stop paying my mortgage because I'm PCSing?
Yeah, that was really painful to read. I think it was a airman maybe stationed in like the Las Vegas area, and they got PCS orders, and they were like, hey, I can't make these payments. And people were like, well, can you sell the house? And they're like, no, it's worth less than what I bought it for. And it's like, all right, man, like that, are you willing to rent it out? And they weren't really considering that as an option either. But at that point, it's like, okay, well, you just made the biggest financial mistake of your life. I mean, You're stuck. You own this property. I mean, this is the risk that you inherit when you buy property. It is not guaranteed to go up in value. And, a lot of people either they just, they probably shouldn't have been property owners to begin with. But if you don't have an exit strategy, if you don't understand that at the end of the day, like you either have to rent it out or you have to keep making the mortgage payments while it sits empty, or you have to sell it. And those all come with costs. It was a sad thing to read on Reddit about that airman, but those are the risks that you take when you purchase property.
So I do have a slightly softer approach on this, maybe not quite as absolute, but I thought of some myths about home ownership that I wanted to share as well. You kind of touched on a couple of them, but the first myth about home ownership is I'll be at my next duty station for 5 years, 7 years, whatever. And usually around that 5, probably 7-year point for sure is where non-military even will say you can start turning a profit on a house because you recover the home value goes up enough to recover for the closing costs and things like that, the transaction costs. So that might be possible. And they may even promise you that you'll be at your next duty station for 5 more years or that they're going to extend you for another tour, but stuff always happens and you never know for sure. So again, you lose control when you're in the military, you lose control over where you're going to be and when you're going to move. Another myth is I'll save money on my taxes with the mortgage interest deduction. You can deduct the mortgage interest on your taxes. Well, really with the recent tax laws a couple of years ago, it's pretty much not an issue for like 94% of Americans that don't itemize. I forget what the stat is, but overwhelmingly Americans are not itemizing their taxes anymore because of the higher standard deduction. And so you're not saving money on your taxes with mortgage interest, deducting your mortgage interest for most people like you think you are or that you used to or your parents did. Another myth, my home will go up in value. It doesn't always. I'm not saying there's a bubble coming. No one knows what the housing market's going to do, but it doesn't always go up in value or it doesn't always go up 3% a year. There's a lot of variables in there. And unless real estate is your expertise and you're willing to do a lot of research and a lot of calculations on what it might look like, just assuming that your house is going to go up in value is not always correct. Another myth, I'm leaving the military and I know for sure I want to settle in whatever town and we're going to be here forever, so I should buy a house. Well, if you look at the stats, a lot of military people get to their first job after retirement or separation and don't end up liking it, and they end up moving again. Most people, overwhelming majority, do not stick with their first job after leaving the military. So if you're doing that just because you're tired of moving, and I feel you, I'm ready to settle down and have my forever home and set it up how I want. But chances are very good that the first job we move to won't likely be our forever home. So watch out for that. And then the last myth that we thought of is rent is throwing money away. So you hear people talk about that all the time. You're just paying someone else's mortgage, but there's a reason you're doing the rent, and it's because you're not paying the cost of home ownership, the maintenance. You're not dealing with the repairs or having to look for a plumber and all that comes with owning a house versus rent. So you're paying for the ability to drop your orders and leave. You're paying for the ability to PCS without the stress of having to sell your house and all the other things that come with the crazy PCS season for our families.
Yeah, the other thing about rent is throwing money away is, okay, so let's say, you rent a place for $2,000 a month and it costs you $24,000 in a year. And it's like, okay, how much house could I get for $2,000 a month? But again, it's like, well, $2,000 a month of what? Like total monthly payments? Well, now all of a sudden your mortgage, that for $2,000 a month might be, the principal plus interest might be $1,200. And then you have all, closing costs for that first year. You should factor in interest on the mortgage, property taxes, homeowners insurance, maintenance. And pretty soon what you'll see is, especially if you're not owning the property for a long period of time and you're going to be selling it after a short, 2, 3, 4-year tour, you might actually be, your rental costs might be significantly smaller than your ownership costs. And what a lot of people don't realize is because of the amortization schedule of mortgages, you're not making significant principal payments on your mortgage until many years, sometimes decades down the line of a 30-year mortgage. So your initial payments, and I've seen this in real time, our buddy actually just texted us this the other day. He's made 24 payments on his mortgage and it's gone down like $5,000 or something over the last 2 years. And that's brutal. Like, yeah. And I see this too I've got a friend who has a property and I think the mortgage was like 1.1 million and they've been making payments for a year and the balance is like 1.1 million. It's just, It's a very, very slow process. And if you're banking on the home value increasing, especially around a military base, newsflash, they don't always put military bases in the most appreciating areas. So diversification, if you're concentrated all of this value, this leveraged asset in an area that might not be that nice to begin with. Oh, and by the way, they close bases all the time. The base realignment, the BRAC commission. If you look at the places after they close a base, a lot of times the home values don't tend to increase. Like the only reason that there were so many homes there to begin with was because there was a base there and it provided jobs and it provided money. So I would be very careful about the myth of rent is throwing money away. And I would almost turn around and be like, show me the numbers. Show me the numbers that this buying a house, what if you assume that the value doesn't go up? Like put that number in and see how long it is until you break even. So renting is okay. It's often a better deal, especially in a high interest rate environment or in a population that has to move every couple of years, like the military. Another myth, Jamie, that I've encountered are homes are a great investment. We had Jeremy Schneider on the podcast from Personal Finance Club, and he likes to talk about like, oh, well, my grandma bought a house for $100,000 in the 1970s and she sold it for $1 million in 2020. And it's like, yeah, it was the best, investment my grandmother ever made. And it's like, it's the best investment your grandmother ever made because she didn't make any other investments. Right? There wasn't this ability to just go out and buy index funds decades ago. I mean, the 401k was invented in the 80s. Home ownership especially if you go back and you look over, over decades, I mean, it barely beats inflation. It's not generally the single family home. And I'm not talking about like commercial real estate. I'm not talking about like farmland. I'm not talking about, other assets that have performed very well, especially in recent years. But I'm talking about a single family house. They're often illiquid. They take weeks or months to sell or buy. They're an endless drain on your cash reserves. They have high transaction costs. They're complex. They often have low returns. You're leveraged, so you owe somebody money on it. They're immobile. You can't move them anywhere. They're fragile. They're easily damaged by weather, fire, floods, hurricanes. They have high taxes usually. So when you're thinking about like, oh, grandma bought a house and, it 10x'd in value over 50 years, it's like, okay, well, what if she invested that money in the stock market? And, you can go back and run a back test calculator. Also, you can't just look at the purchase price and the sale price. How much money do they put into the property over the years? What about all the extra fees and taxes, property taxes, homeowners insurance, interest they paid on any mortgages? Did you factor all that in there as well? So, and realtor fees, those, there was just a big lawsuit recently where realtors have to reduce their realtor fees, but it's often, 5 or 6% of the purchase price and the sale price. So if you're not factoring those things in, you're not looking at a true representation of your returns. And that can really start reducing your returns to the point where it's like, why would anybody, especially over a short period of time, why would anybody buy property? Just a quick note from one of our sponsors, and then we'll be right back to the show.
Hey, Spencer, I got a cousin that just graduated from high school and they're about to start basic training in a few months. Any ideas on a gift I should get him?
Yep, sure do, Jamie. The Military Money Manual, A Practical Guide to Financial Freedom, is a concise, easy to read, and practical guide to your military money. It's the book that I wish someone had handed me on my first day in the military. In the book, I explain the exact money tactics and investing strategies that can enable you to achieve financial independence while serving in the U.S. military. It's available on Amazon, Audible, and my website. It's hardcover, paperback, ebook, Kindle, and audiobook. You can get a special discount using promo code podcast on my website, shop.militarymoneymanual.com.
Okay, we're going to get some hate mail, I think, on this one, Spencer, from this episode. There's going to be people, and we totally get it. We're not saying it's not right for anyone. There are, like Spencer mentioned, if you're out there as a real estate investor and that's your main passion, we're not talking to you in this episode. But we hear people, a lot of times influencers or friends in the squadron or in the unit, hey, like just buy this at each base you go to, and then it's going to cash flow like crazy. Like all you need is like, I'm going to rent it out for $100 more than my mortgage, and then I'm going to cash flow an extra $100 a month. Like, why is that not always the best idea?
Well, I mean, just do the math on the rental markets near most military bases. I mean, if you could rent for cheaper per month and you're thinking about buying, well, when you become a landlord, you're going to be renting at that rate, right? So if your expenses are up here and if your expenses are $2,000 a month and you can only get $1,000 a month to rent out your place, you have to make up the difference. You're responsible making that up. So now all of a sudden this, maybe it's an appreciating asset, maybe it's growing in value, but it's got negative cash flow because you're putting money into it every month to service the mortgage, the maintenance, the homeowner's insurance, whatever taxes, fees, and everything else that goes into home ownership. And, when you have tenants, you can do all the screening you want and, you can only rent to, fellow military people or whatever. But at the end of the day, like, people they can just like trash your home, and it doesn't matter, how much you withhold their security deposit or whatever. I mean, in a lot of states now, they're becoming way more tenant friendly, where people can just, in California right now, I don't think
Squatter.
You can even evict. Yeah, you can't even evict people after they've been there, haven't paid their rent for like a year. So I just completely made that up. I'm not sure what the eviction laws are like in California, but I have heard that it's very tenant friendly, which is great for tenants, another reason to be a renter, but not so great for the landlords. So, there's this myth that real estate is passive income, but it's really not. I mean, you're either paying someone to manage the property, which is reducing your rate of return, or you're doing the work yourself, which is the definition of not passive. So it's frustrating to hear people talk about, oh, it's passive income. And I think people who have done it for a while, like, We had Rich Carey on the podcast episode, I think that was 40 or 30 maybe. We covered the VA loan in episode 40. We had Rich Carey on in episode 30. And he has like something like crazy, like 40 doors or something by the time he retired. Maybe it was in the 20s. And I don't think he would be the kind of person that would say it's passive income. You understand that there is work that's involved. And if you're willing to do the work, can be some reward. But I know for myself personally, putting up all this money, having this it just takes up so much brain space when I own when I used to own property, and that owning index funds there's nothing I have to do. They never call me. I never have to pay a property manager. I just throw more money in. I get my dividends. They increase in value. And that's it. I mean, it's so simple. It's so easy. I mean, that's almost the true passive income right there.
See, I think the stress and the hassle piece of it is what resonates with me the most, because when I get PCS orders, it's a stressful time. Like it just is. Moving, not even when I'm moving myself, like we talked about last summer, but just, getting your orders, waiting for your orders to come. Orders are delayed. Like I can't do anything until I have my orders. I don't have my orders yet. I need this formed in order to get my orders, like where are the kids going to go to school? Where's the spouse going to work? Like all these, what neighborhood are we going to live in? There's so many things going on with moving. And this is a really big financial decision. When you own a house, how do I sell it? Which offer do we accept? Which realtor do we go with? When do we want to sell? They are offering us $2,000 over asking price, but they want to move in now. We're still 30 days from leaving the island or leaving the state or whatever. It just is a lot. And so if I can take away a stressful thing by not owning, then that's a decision that my wife and I have made for all of our moves. We owned once, and Spencer and I have talked before on the podcast. Each of us have owned one home throughout our career, and I'm still in, and I've lived on base twice. Both times when we lived in Hawaii, I lived on base. And a lot of people are like, oh, it's throwing money away by living on base. Well, it's like, actually, it's pretty rare to have a house that looks like mine with air conditioning, and I don't pay any utilities or water or HOA or anything. It's a lot. I'm paying a lot of money. They're taking all my BH, and it's a lot of money, but I don't have to worry about anything. And then when I get orders, I just walk away. So the stress and the hassle is a big selling point, emotional side of finances for me.
Yeah, same here, Jamie. I mean, I don't think people give this enough weight, and maybe that's why we see it a lot.
You can't math it though. There's no math to it. That's why.
True. It's hard. It's harder to math, but I think this is maybe why we see a lot with like the young lieutenants, the young ensigns, the people who haven't been through like a full military PCS, especially with a family. Like you said, like there's stress and hassle. And for me, when I left my first operational duty station, I was going to my second. We hadn't sold our house yet. It was listed on the market. It was for sale, but we hadn't sold it yet. And it took, I think I think we checked in, maybe it was about 30, 45 days after we checked into my new duty station that we finally completed the sale. And it was so liberating signing that paperwork and just being done with it. And we made money on it too. I mean, it was actually a fantastic investment. And both my wife and I, like afterwards, looked at each other and were like, never again, like at least while we're on active duty. There was too much stress. It was too much hassle. I mean, during our 12 years on active duty, I PCS 6 times. So that was 6 moves in 12 years, which is, an average of every 2 years. And I wasn't prepared to be a long distance landlord. I didn't want to sit, on a house that was like empty for a month or two. And, the break even point, like we said, is usually like 5 to 7 years. And it can be even longer if rents are low and interest rates are high. So there's a great calculator. There's a rent versus buy calculator on the New York Times, nytimes.com. You can just Google rent versus buy New York Times. They've got a great calculator there that they updated recently. And if you're considering it, I would implore you to think of other options to grow your wealth and explore and research other options. And because, I think that there is this like pervasive message out there that, oh, you need to own a home. And if you don't own your home, you're on the path to poverty. And that's just not true. You can build wealth, like liquid wealth, in so many other ways. But it's just not talked about as much because guess what? Index funds don't have salesmen. There's no National Index Fund Realtor Association out there pushing index funds with a 6% commission. Actually, I lied. There are mutual funds out there with salesmen, but if you look at a Vanguard index fund, nobody's making a commission on that. So nobody's talking about it. The TSP, nobody's making a commission about that. So yeah, there's a few social media influencers out there that are, hyping up the TSP. And in fact, Jamie and I even have a TSP course, militarymoneymanual.com/TSP, that you can go check out. It's free if you're E4 and below. Just email us, tsp@militarymoneymanual.com. We'll hook you up with a free copy. And then there's a podcast, 24 is the promo code, 50% off. So, and if you're a E5 or above, or you're an officer, every copy you buy goes to an E4. Buys a copy for an E4. You get your copy. But yeah, that's the thing that I thought that real estate was kind of this like intrinsic, must-have path to wealth. And having kind of gone through it now and being far wealthier than I was 15 years ago and not owning any property, I realized that it's kind of unnecessary.
So let's talk about sometimes when the home value does go up, or you get lucky on your timing, or you made really good math and you made a great buy and you have a lot of equity in your home. What are some downsides of just being like, hey, 90% of my net worth is all in my home equity?
Yeah, especially with like the way that home values have shot up over the last couple of years. Like a lot of people are sitting on a lot of equity. And if you were, smart or lucky and you bought a home in, 2020, 2021, and you locked in one of those sweet, like under 3% interest rates, like congrats, well done. But now you're stuck with that house for life. So let's just do an example. Let's say you buy a house for $100,000. It doubles in value to $200,000. And you pay the mortgage down to $50,000 over 10 years. Awesome. So like you have $150,000 of equity. Congratulations. But what can you practically do with that? So this is where I like to say, my wife and I say this to each other all the time, that you can't eat equity. And what do we mean by that? Well, yes, you have this $150,000 of quote unquote equity in the home. It's worth $200,000. Your mortgage is $50,000. So 200 minus 50 is 150,000. But to unlock that, you're going to need to sell the house. And if you live in it, you probably don't want to sell it because you live in it. Okay. So that takes that out. Or maybe the market's a bit slow at the moment, so it's going to take a while to sell. So maybe instead of, accessing the $150,000 next month, it's going to take 3 or 4 months. You could remortgage it, or you could take a home equity line of credit out on it. But now you've got higher monthly payments and you're just going to owe more money. And so, yes, you've turned your equity into cash, but you still have to make those payments on the home equity line of credit or the new mortgage you just got. You could rent the house out. It's worth more now, so maybe you can command a higher rental rate. But then if you live in it, you're going to need to move out or deal with the hassle of roommates or Airbnb guests. And even when you eventually pay the house off, you still, you're going to have rent payments or mortgage payments to worry about, but you're still going to have taxes and fees and maintenance expenses. So home equity is not like cash in a high yield savings account or even stocks in a taxable brokerage fund. You can't easily access the home equity without incurring large transaction costs, whether it's through real estate agents, taxes, fees, or by taking on more debt. And that's going to, your monthly cash flow is going to need to be able to service that debt. Everybody has this dream of like, oh, my home, increases in value. Yeah, that's great. But it's not like when your stock portfolio increases in value because you can just sell the stocks and you can have the cash in your checking account today or tomorrow. On a house, it's a lot less liquid. And I encourage people to kind of think through that about, okay, let's say your home value went up. How are you going to unlock it? Because you either got to sell it or you got to, borrow against it. And maybe neither of those two options appeal to you. So maybe, just something to think about, that you can't eat equity.
So it's not always passive income. It's not always rosy. Like there's a lot going on in the world. And basically the biggest thing I'd close with from me, Spencer, is just give it thought and don't feel that societal pressure or the culture or keeping up with the Joneses, or challenge the story that you've told yourself or that someone's told you. It could have even been a good friend or a parent, that this is what you do and this is your path to building wealth or the path to growing up. It may make sense in some cases, but I think for most military families, if you get rid of this notion that you need to buy a house and that's what people do, then you'll have a clearer picture when you compare what's right for you and your family. When you look at the math without that bias, you'll have the ability to make good decisions and not feel pressured to doing something that doesn't make sense for you. And by the way, we didn't even talk about this yet, but just a quick side note, if you're like drowning in debt, if you're way behind on your mortgage or like you're behind on your rent or you're behind on your bills, you're in credit card debt, like buying a house is almost certainly never going to be for someone that's already behind and can't keep up. It's only going to get worse if you do something that you're not prepared for. So if you have a good down payment, you have a good plan, you have income to cover the mortgage and all that stuff, it still is probably not a good decision for a lot of military families. But if you're behind, it is very, very likely it definitely is not a good decision. And I don't know how to say that with as much force, but to not be absolute as possible. But that's my opinion on it. Over to you, Spencer.
Yeah, the real estate mortgage industry, they love to paint this picture of passive income and, a home is the best investment you'll ever make. And like you said, Jamie, I just think it's a lot more nuanced than that. And you gotta do the math and you gotta think through it. Now, when you leave active duty, that's a different story. Hopefully you follow the steps in my book, The Military Money Manual, and you're close to, or you've achieved financial independence. And if you've got plenty of cash for a down payment, or maybe you could even buy a home in cash. And that completely changes the calculation, especially when you're off active duty and you don't have that threat of being PCS'd or being moved every couple of years. The US is a unique market in the world where you can fix your interest rate for 30 years and you can refinance at nearly any time with low fees. The military opens up possibility for low or no down payment home loans, so the VA home loan program. And we covered that in episodes 40 and in episodes 30. That does come with appraisals though. So, it's not all roses and sunshine. And you'll have a VA loan funding fee unless you're receiving VA disability compensation. So, there's a lot of opportunities out there if you are in the military to get into that first house or to get on the real estate investment train. But like you said, Jamie, I just implore people that it's not a necessary step on the journey to financial independence. And especially if you're in the military, especially if you're on active duty, you just have so little control over where you're going to go next. Why would you add the stress and hassle of home ownership? Let your landlord take the risk on. Just rent while you're on active duty. Don't buy a house on active duty.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of the Military Money Manual podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This helps others find the show, and we really appreciate it. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
The views and opinions presented here are those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of the DoD or its components. Reference to any commercial products or services does not constitute DoD endorsement of those products or services.